Welcome back to CENEDL, the History of Wales podcast. Croeso nôl. Last time we looked at the prehistory of Wales during the Stone Age, Oes y Cerrig. Today we'll be taking our first look at the pages of history, as we examine the Celtic influence on the Welsh language, culture and identity. But that's going to be more tricky than you might think. We don't really know much about the Celts, and less still about the Celts of Britain. But let's give it a bash. Let's go and try and find the Celts. Bant a ni. Let's go. In an effort to find the Celts, I'm here at the wonderful Castell Henllys Iron Age village in Pembrokeshire, Sir Benfro. Here, 4 roundhouses and a granary have been reconstructed on their original Iron Age foundations, some 2,000 years old. The only site in Britain where this has been done. It's amazing and well worth a visit. According to John Davies in A History of Wales, the culture of the Celts was the first culture of true splendour to develop in Europe north of the Alps. He describes that culture as having a tenacious longevity that can be clearly seen 1,000 years later in Irish myths and in the Welsh tales of the Mabinogion. Today we can see that same influence echoing down the centuries when we watch the pageantry of the Druidic rituals of the National Eisteddfod. However, there is a fair bit of disagreement as to how the Celtic influence and the Celtic language came to Britain. In her BBC book The Celts, A Search for a Civilisation, Alice Roberts says that even the name Celt is a problem and that the Celts are difficult to define. Some archaeologists have even suggested that we shouldn't even use the name Celts because it's an unhelpful way of grouping together many different ancient populations that weren't really linked in any meaningful way. So, who were the Celts? By around 300 BC, the Celts were the most powerful people in Europe. Their territory stretched from Ireland in the west to Anatolia in modern-day Turkey in the east. The term Celt, or Keltoi, was first used by the Greeks around 500 BC to refer to distinct people or peoples who possessed a distinct material and spiritual culture and a distinct Celtic language. Celtic culture, known as Hallstatt culture, was dominant in Central Europe around 700 BC and developed from a culture that had flourished around the Alps for around 500 years earlier than that. This Celtic Hallstatt culture spread across Europe and absorbed influences from the south and from the east. According to John Davies, this wide sphere of influence created an artistic synthesis among the most exquisite of the creations of mankind. This style is known as the Latin style, a style characterized by a delight in symbol and pattern with imitations of the divine and the infinite. But how did these influences reach Britain? Some argue that the Celtic languages and influence was brought to Britain as early as 2000 BC with the coming of the Beaker folk, pobl y Diodlestri. If true, this would help to explain how the Celtic languages of Britain and Ireland developed so differently over a long period of time. That is, it would help to explain how the differences between the Q Celtic family of languages, Irish, Manx and Scots Gaelic, became so different to the P Celtic family of Welsh, Cornish and Breton. If it were true that the Beaker folk brought the Celtic language to Britain, we can believe that the roots of the Welsh language go back in Wales for 4,000 years. However, some historians remind us we should be careful when using guesswork like this, no matter how educated such guesses might be. That said, this idea is attractive. The Celtic language was the commercial language of Atlantic Europe, and it's possible that Celtic influence came to Britain not by invasion, but by cultural assimilation over time. Maybe in the same way many people today adopt American culture without actually being American. As for the languages and culture that Celtic displaced, we know very little. But it is possible, according to John Davies, that some of the features we attribute to Celtic culture, the respect for women, the rituals of the Druids, and possibly the syntax of the Welsh language itself, should belong not to the Celts, but to the people who came before them. And this is where the description Celtic is perhaps most appropriate, when we describe the Celtic roots of the Welsh language. The Celts shared a common language that stretched from Ireland and Portugal to Hungary and Turkey. Welsh is a Celtic language.
During the period of Celtic dominance, it seems that the island of Anglesey, Ynys Môn, was of great importance to the order of the Celtic Druids. The Druids were the Celtic priesthood, who maintained and safeguarded the Celtic culture. They knew astronomy and drew their power from their control over the Celtic calendar. Their rituals held the number 3 as having occult significance, and they put the human head in a leading role. This is seen in the story of Bendigeidfran in the Mabinogion, when his head is cut off in order to keep him alive. The Celts worshipped almost 400 different gods, and saw everything around them as holy. But their infatuation with war and their inability to maintain a cohesive centralized state would finally see their influence wane and make way for that of the Romans. And perhaps only because we have so little written testimony of the great European age of the Celts, we often find it easy to ignore their influence on European history. The Celts didn't write their language down like the Romans and the Greeks. Of course, we could fully trust the written testimonies of the literate Romans and Greeks, and these accounts generally emphasize the barbaric nature of their civilization. But wouldn't that be like reading the sports section of the London newspapers the morning after the England rugby team has been hammered in Cardiff and trusting every written word as unbiased fact? For centuries, the Celts dominated much of Europe. Can we really trust what their contemporaries have to say about them? Well, many historians say that if we treat such accounts as exaggerated caricatures of the Celts, then yes, we can trust them to a great extent, and it seems that's all we have to go on. The Celts of mainland Europe were finally defeated at the Siege of Alesia in Gaul in 52 BC, and soon the Romans would turn their attention to the Celtic island of Britain and the land of Wales.
So that's the Celtic influence on Welsh history covered in very broad brushstrokes. No short podcast could ever do such a massive period of European history justice. I urge you to go and find out more about the Celts, and visiting here at Castell Henllys is a great place to start. There's always something new to discover about the past. Join me for the next podcast when we'll look at the Roman influence on Wales and get a first real glimpse of Wales in the pages of history. Hwyl am y tro. Heddwch.